Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Concussion Nerds podcast. And today we are talking about the invisible injury, why concussions aren't one size fits all. And if you've been here a while, you know that I talk about this over and over again, but we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail today. Now, if you haven't, if you are a clinician, a physical therapist, an athletic therapist, an occupational therapist, a chiropractor, a healthcare professional who is listening to this, and you haven't already jumped into my Rethink Rehab workshop that we are doing live on January 24th, that you get lifetime access to, the invitation to come join me anytime I do it live, anytime I add new resources, they are yours for the lowest price it is ever going to be if you register before January 24th. Jump into the show notes, grab the link, and take a peek at it. Believe me when I say, if you're working with individuals with concussion, you're going to want to be part of this workshop. Okay, the invisible injury. Guys, we know this. I have a whole t-shirt line on the website about making the invisible visible, which is that whole concept of trying to bring awareness to the fact that even though we can't physically see somebody with a concussion and we can't see the concussion, like we can see a broken leg or a broken arm or bruises or anything physical like that, it still exists and it's still very real. And we are here to try to continue to bring awareness and shed knowledge and information and education around how, when we are working with someone with concussion, we can't follow a checklist. We can't have a cookie cutter approach that we move through with every single client in the exact same order. We're going to talk about a few of those examples today, right? So technically, we no longer grade concussions, right? Like if you still have someone say you're a grade 1 or a grade 2, and when I first started, I think when I was in physio school, we still talked about grading concussions. We don't do that anymore. It doesn't exist. We also don't necessarily talk about mild to severe concussion. A concussion is kind of a concussion, and concussion falls into that mild traumatic brain injury category as well. Okay. We know super quickly that there's 7 different phenotypes, subprofiles, whatever terminology you like to use for concussion. And how those are impacted can be very different person to person. We have 2 other podcast episodes at least that talk about the different phenotypes of concussion, right? Whether we're looking at vestibular, visual, / ocular motor, cervical, autonomic or physiologic, affective, headaches, I always forget one, cognitive, right? So we know now that for most people, multiple, very rare is it just one phenotype that gets impacted in one person. And even when we're looking at, we can't just do a cookie cutter list or a checklist. Well, just recognizing that there's 7 different profiles of concussion teaches you that you can't treat everybody the same, because if someone comes into your practice and they've got a vestibular, an ocular, and a cervical phenotype, super common, by the way, you're going to treat them one way. But if someone comes in and they're predominantly in the affective phenotype with cervical, you're going to treat them a different way, right? It's why in Rethink Rehab, it's why in Concussion Nerds, we teach you the framework to understand where you need to begin your treatment, because those 2 individuals can't be treated the same way. You'd be doing them a disservice, right? If you're somebody who's listening to this and you're not someone who wants to be the person diving in and treating this, when I speak to physicians, for example, I say, your job isn't to understand how to treat these things. Your job, this is what I say to the physicians, your job is to have the awareness to know how to screen, diagnose, and refer to those of us who do treat. One person can't do it all, right? Now, when we look at things like acute concussion to persistent concussion, there is a spectrum, right? Acute concussion, we know, can be resolved fairly quickly, or for some people, it takes days, months, years, right? No 2 concussions are the same. You can't look at someone and be like, got it. They're going to be good in 2 weeks, right? We have yellow flags. We have indicators that help us know whether someone's recovery is going to be longer or shorter. But also, let's look at some of these other things. So if you look at, there's a scenario of, this was quite a few years ago now, but there was a husband and a wife who were in a car accident. Exact same car accident, One was the driver, one was the passenger, experienced it the same. They saw all the same providers in the beginning. Okay. Same physical therapist, same whoever else it was. The husband recovered. I think it was within a month, 4 to 6 weeks. Husband fully recovered. The wife went on to develop persistent symptoms that she was still struggling with years later. They saw the exact same providers. They started with the exact same, ultimately, treatment plan. One recovered really well, one did not. Why? Right? That's always the question. Why does someone develop persistent symptoms? And we can't put an exact reason on why. We know that if certain things get missed, if we're slower to recovery, if we're not screening for all 7 profiles, then that can absolutely impact recovery. We know that if you're slower to a concussion-specific clinic, that can impact recovery. We know there's other yellow flags that will impact recovery timeline. But this just goes to show it was a husband and wife. They lived the same life. They had the same habits. They ate the same food, more or less. They were in the same car accident together. They started at the same time. They saw the same providers, and one of them recovered in 4 to 6 weeks. One of them it took years. No two brains are the same, right? Research is starting to show us that sport-related concussions tend to recover faster than those related to a motor vehicle accident, or I'm going to throw a workplace injury in here. Now let's talk about why. This should be, I think, fairly obvious for many people, but let's look at this. And I can say from practicing in this area now for years and years and seeing the number of clients that we see that have come through with both sport-related concussion and workplace-related or MBA-related concussions, this rings true. Most of the stat you hear, right, that old statistic of 80% of concussions recover within the first month, I would say clinically, that is what I see in practice for sport-related concussion versus some of the studies like the one that came out in 2022 that highlighted that actually it's more like 55% of people still aren't back to baseline, functional baseline 6 months later. That statistic tends to ring true for those that have more the MVAs, the workplace injuries, that piece of it. And let's look at why. What is the other layer, the huge other layer for so many people that gets factored into this when it's an MVA or a workplace-related concussion? Insurance companies. So not only are you experiencing this feeling of uncertainty in what's happening and in your recovery path or our client's recovery path, now there's a completely outside source that's dictating, in some of these cases, who the person can see, which always boggles me with the United States, for those from the US that are listening to, that you don't get to choose who you get to work with. Boggles my brain. But up here in Canada, that's how a lot of the WorkSafe claims work. So the fact that you don't get to choose who you work with, someone else dictates when you should be recovered. And this big insurance corporation also is the one paying for your rehab, that you have this undercurrent of fear they could cut off at any time when you don't do what they want to do. Think of the stress that layers on to your recovery process. Holy crap. As humans, we like to feel in control of our lives, right? We really do. Type A personalities, higher risk of persistent symptoms. Why? Because we like being in control. And when we lose that control, or we feel like we've lost that control of our life, that is a big stressor. And in these scenarios, you've not only lost control of who you are and how you function, and you can't dictate the way everything in your day-to-day the way you wanted to, but now you have to give up control to an outside source who you feel may or may not have your best interests at heart, who gets to dictate your care path, who you see, and how long you receive this treatment. That is terrifying. So no wonder when you have a client that comes through that door that is more into these elements of MBA, workplace, there is a huge, significant additional layer of stress. And we know that stress is going to impact your autonomic nervous system. We also know that the autonomic nervous system can be impacted with concussion. So now it's being impacted in multiple ways. And we know that's going to potentially impede recovery. It's going to take longer. When I have clients that are wrapped up in legal around their concussions, or insurance companies that are wrapped up in their concussions, I'm not in a place to give legal advice, and I never do. But I will say, if they ask my opinion ever, try and settle it as quickly as you can while feeling like you're getting what you deserve ultimately. But the longer this drags out, the longer litigation drags out, the longer you have this hanging over your head, the continued stress it's going to layer into your life. And that is incredibly hard for anyone else to handle, or for you to handle, right? So this invisible injury, and when we look at why it's not, concussions aren't one size fits all, it's not one size fits all for many reasons, right? It's not one size fits all because of the fact that there's just 7 different profiles of concussion. And depending on how each of those profiles is impacted, how they're integrating together, how they're presenting in the person, you're going to treat them differently. You might have 2 people with a vestibular ocular phenotype, and you still might have to treat them with completely different treatment plans based on the multitude of factors of who they are as a human sitting in front of you, right? It's not just the physiology. It's not just the physiology, right? The other thing that matters that I don't think we talk about enough, that I am starting to see shift in the space, which is really great, but the brain you bring into the accident matters. The brain and the body and the mindset that you bring into the injury matters. The brain, the body that you bring into having the concussion will impact your recovery. So what do I mean about this? If you are an individual that has really never prioritized your health, or you do in some ways, but you work in a very high stress environment, you don't practice tools for regulation, you don't eat super great, and you're just very much that like, go, go, go. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but you're that person that doesn't give that time for yourself, doesn't allow yourself time for space, always hustling, high stress, not eating great. That's going to potentially impact the healing process after you have the concussion. If you're somebody who has had multiple concussions and never had rehab, that can very potentially impact the recovery on the newest concussion. Why? Because while it's possible that without the rehab, your brain recovered, like actually recovered, it's also very possible that your brain learned to compensate. And so now when you have this next concussion, you're bringing in a brain that already wasn't optimally functioning. It was already had areas that were working harder than they normally do to make up for areas that weren't. But our brain is so good at adapting, you didn't notice in your day-to-day. But now you have this new concussion, and say that concussion impacts the part that was working extra hard to compensate. Well, now you've lost your compensation strategies because we have a new injury. So now we're not only dealing with the new injury, but you're going to see and feel everything that had been being compensated for as well, right? If you are someone that has really terrible sleep previously already, right? That piece of things, and then you bring that into a new concussion. We know that sleep is hugely beneficial to our health, both cognitively, immune-wise, helping flush toxins from our system. We also know that concussion can impact sleep. So now you're dealing with someone who already had poor sleep, and now we have a concussion, and now we really have poor sleep. And sleep is so important to healing. That could impact your recovery. We live in a society that is very health reactive. What do I mean by that? We don't do anything until something goes wrong. We don't seek how our brains are functioning until they don't function the way we want them to. We don't see a physical therapist or a naturopath or an allied health person who has skills for helping us optimize our health. We don't see them until we have an injury or something isn't working the way we want it to. Then we react to the injury. My friends, what would happen if we became more proactive, right? So I've just said that the brain you bring into having a concussion will 100% impact the recovery process after. The lifestyle and the health habits and your baseline health that you bring into having a concussion will impact your recovery. Yes, there are some things we can't factor in, like the way the concussion happens, the other outside stressors that can come into that play. But I've just said the brain and the health you bring into the concussion will impact your recovery, positively or negatively. And so let me ask you, because we're all at risk for concussion in some capacity. This is not saying, please don't, it's not to trigger fear. This is not saying we should live in bubbles. This is not saying our kids shouldn't play sports. This is not what I'm saying at all. But any injury, what can we do to improve our health today so that should something happen down the road, we can go into that knowing that we are the best prepared we can be. We get to be our own insurance policy, knowing that we are taking care of our health today while we are healthy and doing the things we know that support our brain, our nervous systems, and our overall health now, proactively, so that when the time comes that we need to be reactive, we are starting in a better place. I always say we go for physicals, right? So I'm in my 40s at this point, which means I'm supposed to do physicals. I have to start getting mammograms, all these other things that happen when you get older. Those are proactive. Why aren't we doing that for our brain health? You look at my clinic alone, I have the ability to give you a brain EEG to look at your cognitive processing. Why aren't we doing that every year as a health check-in for every human being? And when we see what the cognitive processing looks like with our brain EEG, coupled with how your eyes move, how your balance is, we know that eye movements and assessing eye movements can give us insight into early neurological diagnoses. We know that postural stability is linked to different systems, and if we can identify that early, why are we not doing that when it's so readily available? I think it's because we're just not taught. We're just not educated. It's not being shared with us how that if we can catch these things early, we can turn them around. So we can be proactive in what we're seeing instead of consistently reactive. Every concussion is different. Every brain is different. We cannot have just a checklist that we move through. And we talked today just about a few of the reasons why it becomes complex. It becomes complex because every brain that comes into a concussion is different. It becomes complex because of the mechanism and the reason the concussion happened. Is it sport related? Is it more MBA and workplace, which brings in external sources, which are going to add layers of stress? Is it that we have different profile presentations and that's being missed? Concussion is not an easy thing to treat. It's incredibly rewarding. It's incredibly fun. It does not need to be overwhelming when you understand the pieces that you look at and how you look at them and how you build your plans to support your clients around that. But it's this reminder of it is an invisible injury. And while there are tools that's starting to show us how things are shifted, they are not tools that are readily available to all of us. If you're a clinician listening to this, it's so important when you're taking that intake assessment with your client that we look at all the factors when we build the very individualized treatment plan that's required for them to heal. All right, my friends, as I throw my microphone across the room, I hope you're having an amazing day. Until next week, we'll see you soon. That's today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, give us a like, give us a share, give us a tag on Instagram, and please never hesitate to reach out. We love communicating and connecting with you. Until next week, my friends, have a marvelous day.